Hello, I'm Fred Martin. I'm doing this 35-minute reading on the Himalayan Hump operation derived from my book, Among Stars Above the Storm, to provide a convenient resource for my readers and anyone researching the hump operation. We have a second presentation from my book, along with my collaborating author, Michael Martin, no relation, titled The Life Journey of April Girl, a biography of a World War II B-17 and the Colorado heroes who knew her. Please visit my website, fredtmartin.com, for brief video previews of both of these presentations. In Colorado, we will schedule live talks for your group, museum, school, church, charity, and we will provide these talks live anywhere by Zoom. A soft cover copy of the book is offered for $25, or I'm happy to send a PDF for a $12 contribution to our Speakers Bureau. There are over 110 illustrations in the book. If you wish to use photos, please call for permissions and attribution wording. Feel free to call or email if I may be of service in any way.
When the roses bloom again, when the world starts anew, I'll be waiting here for you.
In World War II, the India-China airlift, or Himalayan Hump operation, was the highest loss, highest risk air transport mission of the war. Pioneering aviators carried thousands of tons of gasoline and materiel across the highest terrain on Earth to supply B-29 bases deep in the interior of China that were poised for early bombing missions on Japan. Flight operations had never been attempted over the planet's highest and most rugged mountains, much less on a year-round, all-weather basis. Winds were measured at over 250 miles per hour, and downdrafts were encountered of over 3,000 feet per minute. Add to that the intensely hazardous payload of thousands of gallons of gasoline carried on these flights. Over 10,000 tons were carried across the hump per month. In all, 650,000 tons were delivered over the Himalayas. The cost was the deaths of over 1,300 aircrew and more than 600 aircraft lost. It is estimated that, on average, for each 500 tons, a flight crew member was lost. There were nearly 1,200 bailouts over the hump. 345 men were never found and were listed as missing in action. General Claire Chennault, the region's air commander, said that only men of special caliber could live up to the demands of the hump. They were the swashbuckling pilots of the India-China wing. Now, allow me to explain how I might have never discovered this story about my parents, and I do that in order to encourage others to record their own stories for their families before their histories are lost. Dad had never told many war stories, but on a day fishing with him on a remote Canadian lake, he spontaneously began telling me of aerial gasoline tanker crashes at his World War II base in India. He was suddenly recalling in obvious anguish how he had to watch helplessly as friends perished before his eyes, the flailing of those men's bodies as they were consumed by the flames and the pouring black smoke, and how they slumped over still buckled in their seats as the cockpit exploded and he was powerless to rescue them. I was stunned to silence, but then I awkwardly promised him that one day I would write some of his biography. 7 years after his passing, remembering my promise, I dug into his scrapbook. Yet the clippings in those shoeboxes were entirely from his post-war years with the Cessna Aircraft Company. I have told that story in another book, Reminiscences Over Old Airplanes. But his autobiographical notes offered little about World War II. What he wrote about all his World War II experiences, everything I write about in my book and tell here, was a total of 6 sentences. So this story would have been lost except for my mother. In World War II, she had been secretary to the base commander, Newcastle Army Air Base, Delaware, from where Dad flew B-17s to Europe. After the war, she had her own illustrious career in the federal government, becoming secretary to the director of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. But years later, we had to move to an Alzheimer's care facility. I cleaned out her house, discovering her most secret possessions. Deep in a lower drawer were binders of 211 letters my father had written to her during his 9 months in India. That was nearly a letter each day, hand-penned from a jungle hut or from a freezing cockpit high above the most remote mountain reaches of the earth. She had never revealed that she had kept those letters. Now, my parents divorced when I was 6, so here was the treasure of a secret window on their war-parted love affair. The letters correlated to the pilot logbooks, allowing me to assemble the details of these quite incredible flights and of daily life in India. And Dad had taken many photos that you see in this slideshow. There were old cigar boxes of curled and crumbling black and white photographs, along with a brown case of carefully labeled color Kodachrome slides. In their original deteriorating condition, they never much caught the family's eye. But after electronic restoration, what emerged on the computer screen was startling. These were subjects of historic proportion. I had discovered another treasure that brought the letters from India vividly alive. Now, my critique of most hump histories is that they don't clearly explain why flying across the Himalayas was so important in World War II. Pearl Harbor is often seen as a singular defining event. In fact, it was just the first step in a complex Japanese plan that was so rapidly executed on such a global scale that the scope and speed of this campaign rivals any military conquest in history. Immediately after disabling much of the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese sealed off their homeland along with China and then exploded across the Pacific with incredible speed. They fortified the Marianas and other island chains so that Allied air retaliation could not reach Japan from the Pacific. The Doolittle raid from an aircraft carrier 4 months later was the first U.S. bombing attack on Japan. The day after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces attacked the Philippines, eventually capturing MacArthur's Allied troops. MacArthur vowed to return. They moved into Indochina, Thailand, down the Malay Peninsula to overwhelm British Singapore. They took the Dutch East Indies. Australia and Alaska were threatened. The Axis powers now held over 1/3 of the planet. By that grim December 1941, Japan was poised to move next on India. If they cut off access to China via the Burma Road from the seaport of Rangoon, the Allies could not supply China. Then, on Christmas Eve 1941, Japan brutally attacked British Burma and seized Rangoon. Now, here's a test question. How long did it take the Japanese to go from Pearl Harbor to Rangoon in their attempt to utterly isolate China and control the Pacific? Well, it was accomplished between December 7th and December 24th in 2 weeks. This certainly exceeded Japan's own expectations for the campaign. We can only imagine the astonished jubilation in Tokyo Command Headquarters that would have been in stark contrast to the terror of panicked realization in Washington and throughout the Allied command. With the Burma Road cut off, an attempt was made to build a new road, the Lido Road, connecting the Assam Valley to the Burma Road in the north. Churchill called it an immense, laborious task, unlikely to be completed until the need for it has passed. 20,000 engineers and 35,000 natives labored for 2 years to open the Lido Road from India to China. When finally completed, truck caravans took over a month to cross the 800 miles to China, over grades up to 17% and under continuous Japanese air attacks. Churchill was nearly correct. The road was completed less than a year from the war's end. So, for the enormous requirements of the China base operations, it became clear that ground transport on the Lido Road was not practical. The transport problem would be solved by airlift over the highest terrain on Earth. The Hump operation completed the longest material supply line in the world. After the 12,000-mile ocean voyage from the U.S. to Karachi or Bombay, shipments traveled 1,500 miles on India's dilapidated rail lines. Then every bean and bullet, as one commander put it, had to be flown from bases in Assam over into China. General Chennault estimated that for every ton of bombs delivered to Japan, 18 tons of materiel had to be flown over the Hump. They flew over regions of the earth never before seen by human eyes. These were pioneering aviation routes. Minyakanka is the highest peak in eastern Sichuan. It was thought to be higher than Everest. This is a 1-inch Kodachrome slide taken by my dad from the pilot's seat It's my favorite picture in the collection. Note the monsoon flow piling up against the mountains. The Brahmaputra River, flowing down from the great Himalayan ranges of Tibet and China and the foothills of Burma, flows through the Assam province at the eastern extremity of India. On the banks of that river, amidst tea plantations and rice paddies carved from flowering jungles that are known for a rare species of black tigers that lives there, sits the city of Tezpur. It is a name from an ancient Hindu warrior legend that means city of blood. There, the army had built one of a series of air bases situated along the river, positioned for missions over the high mountains to China. The air route over the hump rose out of the river valley to the northeast over the 10,000-foot Naga Hills, named for the head-hunting tribe that lived there, then crossed the gorges of the Irrawaddy, Salween, and Mekong rivers, and on up to the backbone of the hump, the Sansung Ranges of eastern Sichuan and Tibet. Pilots referred to the route as the Aluminum Trail because of the number of airplanes lost along it. My book provides some technical review of the C-87 that Dad flew. Ernest Gahn, one of my favorite aviation writers, in his book Fate is the Hunter, wrote how he hated the airplane, going on at length deriding the C-87 that almost killed him numerous times. He remarked, "They could not carry enough ice to chill a highball." The C-87 had been hastily derived for the B-24 platform. There were many problems with the airplane. Gahn wrote, "They were an evil bastard contraption, nothing like the relatively efficient B-24 except in appearance. The assembly of parts known collectively as a C-87 would never replace an airplane," he wrote. Another B-24 derivative Dad flew over the hump was the C-109, which had built-in fuel tanks. C-109s burned twice as much fuel getting there as they delivered. Early in 1944, the commander of operations issued a directive that no flights were to be canceled or delayed because of weather. This order was widely referred to as the "there will no longer be weather" decree, and pilots quipped that if the weather could be thus ordered away, perhaps a similar order could be issued to the Japs. Weather had closed the route to China half the time. At the Tezpur base, aircraft were crashing regularly on takeoff in horrific fireballs, just as Dad had described on our fishing trip. Flights were frequently lost en route to Japanese attackers and for reasons unknown. In early June, the ship of the chief pilot was reported missing, then another colleague crashed. Dad wrote, "He's in the hospital with broken bones. Some of his crew were not so fortunate. Our safety record here has just gone flop the last few days. 2 crews lost, 1 definitely all killed, the other missing. Haney's still in the hospital in China. Bill Shaughnessy is okay except for missing most of his teeth. Sure wish the enemy would just fold up, but I can't see it for a mighty long time. To listen to Jap broadcasts from Shanghai, you would think that they are going to win." I have permission from Clayton Cools of MIARecoveries.org. They conduct expeditions into the high mountains to locate wreckages of hump aircraft. They have found 27 missing aircraft and 279 personnel, some listed for decades as missing in action. Air bases on both sides of the hump were built employing native labor. Entire families worked on India bases, while in China, rock crushers, mostly women, broke gravel using hammers, then carried it to the airstrip in baskets on their heads. Up to 100,000 coolies worked on each China base. Construction equipment was scarce. Ox carts were used to haul rock. Hand-drawn rollers pulled by 100 coolies or more flattened the field. The result was a bumpy airfield about 6,000 feet in length. Dad's August 14 trip was typical. A 10.5-hour round-robin to Chengdu, back over to Sukarating, and down to Tezpur. Now, for perspective, let me say it's a mild form of torture for me to sit in a modern airline seat for 10 hours. At least it's heated, pressurized, and sometimes they serve pretzels and beer. But the C-87 was freezing cold the whole way, and you had to wear an oxygen mask. At 4 a.m., Dad was called out for another flight, a 7-hour, 40-minute round trip back to Chengdu. Dad still wrote to Mother that night, "Now it's after 10, and I just got through talking to friends. I am so tired and dopey that I really don't know what I'm doing half the time. It sure gets dark out over that 1,000 miles of stone at night. That is, until we hit the roughest weather yet last night and the storms lit things up like day. We were barely getting over the top of the thunderclouds, and when we broke clear, we were flying among stars above the storm. Now, that's the passage that gave the title for my book. A few days later, he wrote, I need a good cry tonight, but just can't. One of our finest friends, one of the best fellows I have met, was killed last night. His ship crashed and burned right after takeoff. On takeoff in a loaded tanker, the airplane is sluggish, barely airborne, balanced on a tight wire of airspeed wherein single mile-per-hour increments make all the difference between a climb beyond hill or trees or mushing back to the ground. A backfiring engine, a downdraft, a payload slightly off center of gravity, a momentary lapse in concentration, these were only some of the factors that could bring down the airplane and its 6,000-gallon load of gasoline. The India-China airlift was a non-combat operation, and that imparted an added sense of tragedy to the frequent crashes. If an airline or any transport operation suffered such multiple crashes each week, with many right at the airport, then what pilot would continue flying and what passenger or crew member would ever board the aircraft? Now let me read to you a series of flight accounts from among Dad's 66 missions to give you a sense of the unrelenting pace of operations. On the 3rd of September, there had been a 10.5-hour trip to and from Chengdu. The next day, the flight was 9 hours, 45 minutes to and from Penshang. The next day, 11 hours to Kwanghan, then Kwanghan again on both the next 2 days. There was no time to worry over the deaths of other pilots. The most imminent enemy was crushing fatigue. Just one of these trips over the hump was a flight of expeditionary proportion at this time in aviation history. 2 days later, Dad flew his 40th trip over the hump to Penshang. Next day, he flew number 41 back to Penshang and Sukherating. The next day, 10.5 hours to Kwanghan, then another round trip to Kwanghan on the same day. That was an unimaginable 22 flight hours of flying the Himalayas in one 24-hour period after one night off in 10 consecutive days of such flights. After a flight to Kwanghan, Dad wrote Mother, "Did you hear? We bombed Japan yesterday. It was B-29s from our theater." This is what the massive effort was all about, hauling all this gasoline over the mountains. He went on, "I can't answer your question about where the B-29s are. It's secret. No one but the Japs and a couple million other people know where they're based. They sure are big, though." He had no idea at that moment that he would be a B-29 commander in 10 months. These B-29 missions through Kwanghan defy belief. Flying from Calcutta over the hump, they landed in Kwanghan to refuel and load ordnance. Then the incredible round trip to bomb Japan, back to refuel in Kwanghan, then return to Calcutta where the bombers were safer from Japanese attack. The B-29 was new and not fully proven. In raids in mid-1944 on Japan, only 5% of bombs hit targets. 100 aircraft were lost, most to mechanical failures. These were the first bombing attacks on Japan since the Doolittle raid 2 years earlier. So, morale value was high, but actual strategic value of all this effort over the hump was far below the best hopes. General Curtis LeMay, in charge of B-29 operations, was waiting for Tinian and Guam to be secured so the 29s could be moved to Pacific bases. The father of my good friend Margaret Schmidt, a Denver psychologist who specialized in PTSD, was Captain William Wellinger, who flew these India to Japan missions. He named his giant bomber after his daughter Margaret, and for this 1943 Robert Young and Lorraine Day film, a movie that portrayed the horrors of aerial bombardment in London. I think that revealed a very poignant pathos in the heart of Marty's dad. My dad flew with Barry Goldwater. They were friends, who became U.S. Senator and presidential candidate. A couple of my father's orders to India, that Mom had also secretly saved in her drawer, were signed by George McGovern, who also became a U.S. Senator and presidential candidate. McGovern's heroic service flying B-24 bombers is detailed in Wild Blue by Stephen Ambrose. 2 years ago, I met Alex Dominic by happenstance in a bar, and we discovered that our dads were stationed in Tezpur flying C-87s at the same time, and they had even flown a check flight together. Peter Dominic became U.S. Senator from Colorado and ambassador to Switzerland. Years after the war, both men contracted multiple sclerosis. More on that in a few minutes. Alex published his father's India War Diaries in this book. The Veterans Museum, Broomfield, has a priceless collection of records and artifacts from Hump pilot Lieutenant William Harris. Logbooks, flight records, charts, Distinguished Flying Cross photos. These were discovered in an abandoned storage locker in Denver. I traced county records of 2 homes owned by his widow and daughter in Denver. I found a voter registration record for his son in Colorado. And I found William and wife Lola Jean together at Fort Logan. Then the trail went cold. We have not been able to locate daughter or son or grandkids to reunite them with these precious family heirlooms of their heroic father. Maybe that's a cautionary tale for families who have not carefully preserved war records and photos of family veterans. Let me know if we may assist. Now back to my story. After that day of 22 hours of flying, Dad wrote Mother a letter. Dearest Sally, had a long trip yesterday and didn't get to bed until 2 a.m. today. Flew 35 Chinese back to India last night and landed them at another base, so was late getting home. These were Chinese nationalist soldiers under Chiang Kai-shek. Most had no boots, only straw sandals. The bedding issued to some units was 1 blanket per 5 soldiers, and pay was so low even officers could not afford any more than rice. They were plagued by dysentery, smallpox, and typhus to such a degree that some units had 40% losses without entering combat. Dad wrote of his passengers that night, "You have never smelt a real odor." Because of censoring, what Dad could not mention in this letter is that several of these Chinese soldiers had died in his airplane. It had been a 6-hour flight over the mountains with no oxygen at sub-zero temperature. Years later, that day while fishing in Canada, Dad wondered if the families of the dead ever found out what had happened to them, or if the soldiers who had survived the flight had ever found their way back home across the Himalayas. Dad actually took very few photos of flight operations, and he mostly wrote about his growing fondness for the people of Assam. He became close to one family in particular and spoke of the most peaceful family life and the most beautiful children in the world. He wrote, "They gave me coconuts and pineapples. If I'd taken it, I would have had enough food for a week, and they didn't have enough for themselves." He wrote often about his bearer or house servant Abdul. When Mother sent Abdul a gold watch from the States, he ran outside so as to not be seen crying. He thought my mother looked beautiful and plenty healthy, but he wondered why she never came to visit. Dad bought a Victrola record player from a departing pilot, and Abdul took command of it, playing his favorites, which were opera. When his tour ended, Dad gave Abdul a month's pay and the gold pen he had written all the letters with. Abdul ran from the Basha to not be seen crying. Dad's roommate was the base chaplain he called the preacher. Dad wrote Mother, "He keeps the drinking and the women parties down." Though the preacher much enjoyed that Dad would pack bottles of beer in the bulkheads of his airplane that would freeze over the mountains so he could serve ice-cold beer back in the hot jungle. The preacher stowed away on flights to China, and Dad gave him flying lessons over the Himalayas. Dad wrote, "He was like a little kid at the controls, on the adventure of his life." Dad visited families in China. Went to a remote place, and the women still bind their feet, and they're no larger than their hands. Is this the 20th century? His photo of this woman at the spinning wheel is another of my favorites. It was becoming cold in China and still swelteringly hot in Tezpur. Dad was becoming chronically ill with cold and fever and was visiting the infirmary regularly. Yet even after very long flights, he always escaped to visit his Indian family. We'll come back to this chronic flu in a few minutes. On October 7th, they took off toward China. Heading into the mountains, they encountered turbulence so severe that a man's head would be smashed on the ceiling of the cockpit if not for the shoulder harnesses holding them to their seats. A barrel burst and 55 gallons of gasoline spilled out on the deck. This is the era of many arcing electric relays and red glowing vacuum tube radios. Dad's friend and co-pilot, Sam, began frantically tugging on his harness releases, wanting to get up and get his chute on. He preferred bailing out in a thunderstorm over the Himalayas to dying in a fireball. Releasing the shoulder harness would have been enough to kill him. Eventually, they broke out in the clear and set a return course for Tezpur. They shut down all the electrics they could and planned their landing of the heavily loaded freighter. The landing gear could be cranked down by hand, but they were going to have to use the electric landing flaps to stop the airplane on the jungle strip, and there would likely be a small electric arc when they hit the switch. Dad winced as he reached for the flap switch. He hesitated and then lowered the flaps. He wrote Mother, there was no reason the aircraft didn't explode. Dad's log entry for this flight has the rather understated notation, returned with leaky gas drum. 2 nights later, another ship crashed on the field and Dad went to the hospital. There were 5 aboard, he wrote Mother, all real badly hurt. I gave a transfusion to the pilot so I can't fly again for another day. He died a few minutes later, which doesn't speak too well for my blood, but he was so badly mangled and broken, and it's a miracle he lived even a minute. Somehow this crash doesn't bother me a bit, but the last one I told you about had me pretty upset. Several ships have just disappeared en route, the Japs have gotten a couple, and with all the crashes going on, you get so that it's just another one. I have a reader in New Hampshire, Ryan Lurch, who has done extensive research about his great-uncle who was lost over the hump. After he read this passage in my book, he found this report from Tezpur about this very same crash that Dad refers to here. The next night, Dad mailed this letter and went out for another flight. He had a new co-pilot he had known on the North Atlantic runs. It was the fellow's first trip over the hump. It was stormy that night. Visibility was obscured as they held short in the rumbling tanker waiting for clearance. Dad took the runway and accelerated. Halfway down, another tanker came looming out of the dark fog head on. The other pilot was taxiing and he kicked his rudder pedal hard and turned his ship off the runway into a ditch that ran alongside. That ship's nose wheel dropped in the ditch and the big double rudders cantilevered up in front of Dad's accelerating airplane. There was no time to react and no space to maneuver in. His ship had not reached liftoff speed, but Dad pulled back hard on the control column and the gasoline-laden C-109 wavered off the ground, with one of the main landing gears striking a rudder on the other aircraft. Dad's ship yawed wildly, but somehow remained in flight and clawed out over the trees. After gaining a stable flight attitude, they had to make a decision. The landing gear must have been bent or broken, they reasoned. Surely the tire must have been blown out. The co-pilot went back to look out a window. He tried to assess damage with a flashlight. Nothing was apparent, but it was impossible to know. Should they return for landing in Tezpur overloaded with gasoline, or try retracting the gear and burn off their wing tanks flying to China, where they might not be able to lower the gear but would be lighter for landing? Their duty was to deliver the fuel to China. They retracted the gear and had a very anxious flight to Kwanghan. The landing there was without incident. A hearing was later convened on this runway accident. The field controller that night charged that Dad had taken the runway without a clearance. Dad's testimony was simply honest. I was so tired and sleepy, I really can't tell you if I had a clearance or not. 2 other pilots listening on the field frequency that night testified they had heard the clearance. Had they heard it, or were they covering for a colleague? Either way, all knew it was foolish to court-martial a competent pilot. The hearing was closed. The next night after this harrowing flight, Dad went to relax at the outdoor movie before his next departure scheduled for the early morning. The movie was Shine On, Harvest Moon, but it was cut short when there was an explosion and the sky lit up like day. Another tanker had crashed a mile after takeoff, not as fortunate as Dad had been just the night before. It all seems so insane and useless to me, he wrote Mother. It isn't the hump that's dangerous, but the rushing and assigning of unqualified personnel. He returned to his basha late that night from the crash scene. The chaplain and several others were on the porch conversing in low tones. They gave him more bad news. The young pilot who lived next door was missing. They found the wreckage in China the next morning. He wrote, 4 more dead, all of them. Penny-wise and pound-foolish the way the Army does things, and it sure makes you sick. We have a cute little puppy now named Ding Hao. The young man who was killed last night brought her back from China and raised her on an eyedropper. Now that he's gone, she seems to have adopted us. By early December, another crew was lost and pilots were refusing to fly. He wrote, there are several who are afraid to fly the hump, and some of them we used to think of as rocks. One captain was court-martialed when he refused and got a dishonorable discharge. We lost a ship the other day, or I should say another one, and everyone is jittery. I don't enjoy this, but the scariest part for me is working with crew members who are afraid. You never know what to expect from them. In late December, just before Dad's last flight over the hump, Tokyo Rose, the Japanese radio propagandist, said in her broadcast that pilots crossing the hump would die and never return. Dad wrote Mother about what Rose had said, and he remarked, "Now you better start worrying about me." His 66th and last trip over the hump was flown amid a flurry of alerts on the day after Christmas 1944. On that flight, they had to circle Chungkung for 4 hours, waiting for a Japanese attack on that base to end before finally receiving landing clearance. Back in Tezpur, as he taxied in and shut down the empty C-109 for the last time, I imagine that he walked away with very little regret. So, by reading all these repetitive flight narratives, I wanted to give you a feel for the incredible daily stress and trauma on these crews. Along with many hump pilots and crew, Dad was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and Air Medal. The citation reads in part, "For extraordinary achievement in more than 600 hours of operational flight over the dangerous and difficult Assam-China air routes, where enemy interception and attack was probable and expected, flying at high altitudes over impassable mountainous terrain through extremely treacherous weather conditions, necessitating long periods of operation on instruments, encountering severe icing conditions and mechanical difficulties requiring courageous and superior performance to overcome, they established their missions with distinction. Their heroic achievement in the face of hazards and difficulties faced continuously with steadfast devotion to duty reflects much credit on themselves and the Army Air Forces of the United States." The main benefit of writing my book and what made it all worthwhile is that it became an application submission along with my second book that got Dad inducted into the Kansas Governor's Aviation Hall of Fame. Over 350 Kansas aviation folk were there that night at his ceremony. His picture now hangs next to Walter Beach, Clyde Cessna, Bill Lear, Amelia Earhart, and other Kansas aviation luminaries. Warriors suffer many losses far from the battles long after the war is over. Dad contracted multiple sclerosis years after the war. He had thought the cause of his MS was his long exposure to carbon monoxide and fuel fumes in old airplanes. The Mayo Clinic, where he received his treatment, had suggested that. Senator Dominic thought his MS was from a trip to Mexico. Yet, more recent research has also theorized a viral cause of neurodegenerative diseases and suggests that a cold virus originating on the Indian subcontinent might be a common cause of both MS and Alzheimer's disease. I want to bring out this issue in my talks and books if other families are wondering about such a disease cause. With a viral causation, perhaps there's a hope for a vaccine in future. This has caused me to consider a possible implication of Dad's chronic viral illnesses over those months in India. Once the virus infects, it may lie dormant for many years and then find a venereal transmission pathway. After long years of caring for both my parents' conditions, in 1994, my mother died of Alzheimer's disease as I held her in my arms. So I now wonder, in light of this new research, was she the final casualty of World War II in this story? When I was young and both of my parents were vibrantly alive, I did not know enough to ask for old war stories. The letters written to my mother from Dad in India are a treasure I did not discover until she was moved to a nursing home in the 1990s. She had kept them to herself deep in a secret drawer. In one letter, Dad had written Mother that he was surprised and happy to learn that she was saving his letters. He wrote her, "Who knows? Maybe someday they will become a diary of all this." So here my parents have come together finally to tell you this story. Thanks for your kind attention. Many families have boxes of old photos, unknown artifacts, and may recall snippets of stories once told. Growing up in Wichita in a Cessna aviation family, I was blessed with many boyhood adventures with my dad. Yet, had I not discovered these heirlooms and undertaken this project, I would never have really known who my father was in life without knowing what he experienced and suffered as a World War II aviator.
When the birds take back the sky and the night smiles above, we'll be free again to